It was one of the darkest chapters of the Iraq War. 7 years ago, on the morning of September 16, 2007, Blackwater security guards working as private contractors for the State Department opened fire on unarmed Iraqi civilians at a crowded Baghdad intersection. They killed 17 civilians. 7 years later, that chapter may finally be coming to a close. Yesterday, 4 of the Blackwater guards were convicted of murder, manslaughter, and weapons charges in a U.S. court, and they were jailed immediately. Throughout the trial, 30 Iraqi witnesses were brought to Washington to testify, the largest number of foreign witnesses ever brought to the United States for a criminal trial. One of those who testified was a man whose 9-year-old son was shot in the head and killed that day while riding in the backseat of the family car. A few years ago, in an interview with The Nation and Democracy Now!, he recounted the details.
بفضل صيح كتلة وابني كتلة وابني كتلة وابني. يعني شو اقول لك، يوم القيامة بدم بارد بقلب قاسي ظلوا يضربون علينا في كل الاتجاهات.
The 4 Blackwater guards found guilty yesterday still await sentencing, but their boss, the former head of Blackwater, Eric Prince, has not been held accountable and continues to work in the highly profitable business of security contracting. Joining me now is the co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, Faiza Patel, and from Baltimore, an attorney who represented Iraqi victims in civil cases against the Blackwater security firm, Susan Burke. Susan, let me start with you, given your background on this painful chapter in American history, which I think a lot of people would argue is not yet closed. Is this the justice that these victims have been looking for?
It really is, and I have to commend the Justice Department for staying with this. At the beginning, the State Department did just a dreadful job, gave these folks some sort of conditional immunity, which led to a lot of problems, but the Justice Department stuck with it, and what we've seen is the type of justice that America is famous for, a fair trial in civilian courts that reach the right outcome.
Faiza, let's get your sort of thoughts on this. We started talking about this chapter and whether it is ongoing, the crimes that happened in the gauzy haze of war, and maybe some would argue continue to happen today. Do you feel like this affords some kind of closure?
Well, I think it certainly affords closure for the victims and their families in this particular case. But I think as a broader kind of policy matter, we haven't really grappled with what it means to have private contractors part of our military operations. We still don't have clarity as to when we should be using contractors, what roles they should be playing alongside U.S. troops, and really importantly, in hiring contractors, are we taking account of their human rights records? Because Blackwater, you know, continues to have large contracts with the government, as do many of the other companies that have been implicated in human rights abuses. And that, for me, is a huge ongoing question that we haven't really grappled with.
Yeah, Susan, to Faiza's point, Eric Prince is still working, and in fact, writing op-eds on his company's website saying, you know, we're not happy with the U.S. performance on ISIS. You should hire us, basically.
Right.
You know, he has not been held accountable at all. Do you think that?
No.
How has that happened?
Well, and it's really a national disgrace that what we've done is let government agencies continue to hemorrhage money to these contractors without having systems of accountability. For example, there can be a mercenary who uses excessive force for one company. He gets fired for that use of excessive force, but he gets turned around and picked up by another one.
Right.
So we need to actually follow the lead of Britain and other countries and tightly regulate this industry, if not actually outlaw it completely.
Yeah, Faiza, to the point of contractors, in July of 2012, we had $6.6 million in contracts with Academy, which is the new name for Blackwater. In May of 2014, that number had gone up to $8.8 million. I mean, you talk about oversight of the folks that we are contracting out to do our dirty work overseas. What is the likelihood that we put any sort of oversight in place?
Well, I think that Well, I mean, to give the U.S. government some credit, since the Blackwater and the other abuses that happened, they have tried to tighten up their contracting procedures, but they haven't gone far enough. And as I mentioned, like the big piece that when they're figuring out who to give a contract to, I think they look at sort of their ability to protect staff, and they look at cost, right? But they also need to be looking more broadly at what the human rights record is of a particular company and what reputational consequences it's going to have for the United States to hire particular companies. And from what I can tell, that certainly doesn't, at least publicly, factor into their calculations, and they need to be thinking about
well,
it.
And do you think that that's driven in part by the fact that it's much easier and neater to outsource the war to security contractors? I mean, we have an interest in having a successful relationship with security contractors because we have the debate over boots on the ground. This is a much easier way of dealing with the enemy.
Well, I guess that's right. I mean, there was, as you know, in the Bush administration, this sort of drive towards privatization is a good thing, whether it's in the military or you're talking about the prison system. So there was this overall mindset. And certainly using contractors means that the number of actual U.S. forces that you have on the ground is limited. Exactly. They're not in harm's way. You're not getting those body bags coming home and the true cost of the war sort of coming home to people here. Contractors allow you to kind of hide exactly what it is you're doing, and they give you a step back from accountability. So it wasn't the U.S. government or U.S. soldiers that did Nisour Square. It was Blackwater. It was them. It wasn't us. And that, I think, creates some problems.
Well, yeah, that gulf creates a huge amount of problems. Susan, this case has gone through various iterations. It was at one point dismissed. Obviously, it seems to have come to some sort of ending here. There is some talk of appeal. Do you think that this is it as far as this incident with Blackwater?
Well, I think it's it in the sense that we have had an American jury who heard from people on the ground, heard from the same victims that I spoke with, who told the story of what happened that day. So we now have, for the history books, an irrefutable indication that this was murder, this was manslaughter, it never should have happened. Regardless of what happens on the appeal, that jury verdict will always stand for that historic point. So in that sense, it is over. Justice has been rendered. Now, obviously, the criminals are going to try to get the verdict overturned and use different forms of arguments to do so. So as a legal matter, it's going to continue to proceed.
Well, but it is an important moment for our criminal justice system and the Department of Justice. Faiza, before we go, just to highlight the point that you were making, in the Balkan Wars, the ratio of contractors to American military was 1 for every 50 soldiers. By 2011, private contractors constituted over 50% of our total force in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is dramatic how much we are using these folks. Faiza Patel and Susan Burke, thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up.